What's up, guys? I'm Laura from Reading in Bed, and today I just want to talk a little bit about In Our Mad and Furious City by Gunaratne. This was just recently snubbed for the Man Booker shortlist. It was longlisted though, and it's a debut novel, so that's not nothing. That's kind of still a big deal. Like I mentioned in my sort of Friday Reads video, it was funny that in such a American and Canadian and Irish heavy long list and now short list, like this is probably the most England-centered book, I guess. Like, it all takes place in a particular neighborhood in London, and the setting is not incidental whatsoever. Like, it's very, very important that it takes place all in this one very specific neighborhood that has a lot of history of racial unrest, and that kind of like comes boiling to the surface again in the course of this book that takes place in kind of contemporary, I'd say maybe like 10 years in the past. But it didn't make it, so I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. Not a full review, because I just finished it on Wednesday and it hasn't been long enough. I haven't really processed it. But I really hope that this book doesn't fall off the radar now that it's, you know, not up for the prize anymore. So kind of two-ish things that I wanted to talk about. First, I wanted to talk about the structure of this book and what it reminded me of. So I'll just describe it a little bit. So this isn't being described as a novel and short stories, and I guess it's not really, but we do have many very short chapters. We do often see the same incident from different perspectives, but often they're quite different. Like, each chapter is a self-contained thing. You could almost read them as short stories or vignettes. So there's kind of these very choppy short chapters, the multiple perspectives. There's 5 characters that we kind of cycle back and forth between. And 3 of them are teenagers, and 2 of them are sort of the generation before that. Like, they're older, but not elderly, let's say. They're middle-aged. So we've kind of got a multi-generational perspective that we're cycling through, and each of those 5 characters is dealing with trauma. You know, I mentioned racial unrest. It's not all of it is due to that, but most of it is, and most of it has, like, it's really the better way to say it is all of these characters are dealing either with the fallout or present day extremism of one kind of another, whether it's extremism of like anti-immigration sentiment or you know, the Troubles in Ireland, or you know, in the present day, it's sort of like anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic sentiment. So, or indeed like Muslim and Islam kind of extremism itself. So there, yeah, extremism of you know, of multiple things comes into each of these characters' lives. I mentioned that there's a very strong sense of place, so we're not only just in London, but we're in the Neasden neighborhood of London, and really even more so, like, we're in one sort of housing estate, which is kind of like what we think of as projects, I think, in America, like housing projects. So I think they're called council estates in the UK. And all of these stories, like, we start kind of with all these characters that are in or around this housing estate, and all 5 of them eventually get pulled into this one sort of, you know, very dramatic event at the end that has tragic consequences. And as we get closer and closer to that event, the chapters get shorter, the pacing picks up, there's like a lot of tension, a lot of foreshadowing and that kind of thing. So with all of that, with the multi-perspectives, the youth and other generations, the trauma, the sense of place, the building towards a big event, all of that should remind you, if you've been following the hyped books of the moment, it should remind you of They're There by Tommy Orange. You know, other than the like wildly different settings, all of that is true of They're There as well. In They're There, of course, we've got, you know, Indigenous characters in Oakland, California, and all of it is building towards a powwow at which things go terribly wrong and there's tragic consequences. And in that one, we have several teenage characters. We have sort of their, you know, like the parents' generation. We have them dealing with, you know, trauma of colonialism and how that affects people throughout their lives and how it severs family ties and pulls people apart. And as it builds towards that powwow, things get increasingly, fast-paced and choppy, and it all sort of builds towards this huge climax. So I found both these books very similar in their structure, and that surprised me, because now I should mention there was a Goodreads review that actually mentioned that. I didn't think of it on my own. I did read it in a Goodreads review, but once I read it, I was like, wow, like, yeah, the parallels are actually very stunning, and I would say that this book pulls it off better. Now, this just, the lack of nuance in 5-star ratings really comes through, because I rated both those books 4 stars. Neither are perfect. Both are debut novelists. Both sort of, make a few mistakes, I guess you could say. But for me, In Our Mad and Furious City got a couple things right that There didn't. One of them was just having fewer characters so that you can hold them all in your mind, but that the 5 characters in this book had such distinct voices, and compelling voices. I know those are cliched words and it's hard to describe like what is meant by voice, but in there I would often forget, like, who's this character, and it all, like, the tone all sounded very authorial. Like, it sounded like this is Tommy Orange saying something, whereas in here it really felt like Arden or Selvin or Yusuf was speaking, and I got the feeling that they were distinct people, they were real people, they had different points of view, really different perspectives, despite all being in this one very, like, not, like I said, not even just the same neighborhood, but the same housing estate. And the pacing was better here too. So I mentioned, like, in both books, they're all kind of short chapters building towards this big traumatic event. In there it just, I don't know, it was off. Like, sometimes it was really fast paced and then it would slow down, and then, like, I don't know, it just wasn't very consistent for me. Whereas this one, man, I was reading the last 30 pages of this at work only because I forced myself to put it down the previous night, because it was like midnight. I'm at work reading these last 30 pages, and it was like, I knew I shouldn't be reading it at work because it was so intense and so emotional, and I cried, and I was wearing makeup, and I had a meeting with my boss. But that, like, in a book like this that builds towards something, that's how I want to feel. As I get closer and closer to that, I want it to get more and more intense and really draw me in and make me cry. I'm a book crier, and I love that. So yeah, I mean, I would recommend both books. There is really good too, but for my money, In Our Mad and Furious City, if you're interested in, like, youth voices and, really good sense of place and dealing with trauma, historical trauma, race-based trauma, extremism trauma, that's, I really recommend that. Because I went in thinking it was going to be relatable to London Stanny, and it's really not, because in London Stanny, this is also a book about youth culture in London, and it's second, generation immigrants, much like In Our Mad and Furious City. But the thing about this book is it's presented anyway as a very homogeneous group. Like, these are all kind of second generation Indian immigrants. They're all around the same age. They're from very similar backgrounds, very similar class. Also, like, they're definitely more sort of middle class, striving for upper class, whereas these guys are like, I don't know, like working class, lower class, like they're, like this is entrenched poverty these guys are living in. But they also come from very different backgrounds. All 5 characters, are different. There's first generation and second generation immigrants. There's people from Ireland, people from Jamaica, people from Pakistan. So there's, yeah, this sort of reflects more of, like, a multicultural kind of society. London Stanny, of course, there's lots of racial tension in here too. That's kind of the point of this book as well, but it's just a more, like, it's a look at one particular group for the most part. If you've read this and you know the twist, say no more, right? Okay, so that was what I wanted to say about the structure and comparable books. The other thing I don't know how much I want to say. My favorite character in this book was Selvin. He is one of the teenagers, so he's like 17 or 18. He has kind of a relationship going with this teenage girl, and there's 2 scenes in particular. One in which he's kind of remembering a past encounter and thinking, I'd like to do that again. And then a second scene in which they actually have an encounter. And, I was trying to write down, like, what I felt about these. encounters, like, you know, we've got a news cycle right now where we're very concerned with, you know, the activities of 17-year-old boys, and should that affect the rest of their lives, and, you know, consent and all this stuff. And, you know, while this, you know, the scene I'm describing in here is not a rape scene by any means, but it's just a very... it's probably the most nuanced and realistic and raw and disturbing, but also kind of tender in a way, sex scene that I've read about, and like very much from the perspective of a teenage boy. Like, we are in his head, we're experiencing it through his eyes and, you know, his senses, you know, so it's, yeah, it's a little like disturbing to read. More than a little. Like, I actually can't stop thinking about it. But it's not, yeah, I don't even know how to put it. You know, it's not trying to force you into one opinion or one perspective. It's just, this is what happened. This is what it felt like. This is real. And it's challenging. Like, it's challenging to read, because then you have to sit with that and be like, whoa, you know, what did I just read, and how does that relate to my experience, and how does that relate to, you know, other similar sorts of stories that I've read and how they've been presented. Yeah, jarring is the other word I wrote. I'm jarred, I'm shook, as the kids say. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even get into, like, calling it right or wrong, or calling Selvin a bad person or a good person. Like, that's way too simplistic for the story that's presented in here. So, if you've read the book, I'd love to know what you think. I don't want to say much more, just because, you know, until you read it and experience it. But I guess I just want to put out there that there is more to this book than just, you know, I think it's often presented as, like, this is just a gritty kind of teenage boy coming of age. And it is, but there's a lot more to it than that. And I really just hope that people read it and keep talking about it. Okay, thanks for watching.